Okay, students, so we're going to start working on value. Value is the last real big tool in our toolbox as far as the major components of drawing. We've done gesture, contour, looked at negative space, and now value is probably the crowning one, the one we're going to work on the most because it has the most effect on the ability to create illusion, realistic, believable illusion. So what we have in front of us is a value scale. Over here on the left, you have the white of the page or the lightest light that you can get. And all the way over here on the right, you have the darkest dark. And everywhere in between, you have these little gradations, little steps of value where it gets lighter and lighter as you go in one direction. And the point of value drawing is to train yourself to start seeing all those small steps, those very subtle incremental changes in the lightness and in darkness of things. And by recording the information, you get very realistic looking drawings. And while this slide is up, I also want to point out something that's referred to as relative value. And so here we have a middle gray. You see the gray chip down here. And notice how different it looks depending on the sort of background it's sitting upon. Over here, that same gray color looks very dark, but when compared to the dark background, that little gray trip seems much lighter. So something to keep in mind. Sometimes, instinctively, when you want to see something darker, you would think to add more charcoal or you would add more pigment to make it darker. But you might realize that actually by lightening things behind it, or the opposite, the reverse, if you want to make something lighter, sometimes by darkening things behind it, it will in turn make it appear lighter. So just remember that it's kind of a push and pull. And as you work on these drawings, think of them as being fluid. You can add charcoal and you can also easily take it away. That's what your erasers are for. And it's sculptural, so you can dig back into it, use those erasers to put light back into your drawing if you put too much charcoal down or vice versa. So let's talk about the anatomy of what we're seeing, the anatomy of light. So here we have a sphere, a white sphere, and you can tell the direction of light because of how the cast shadow is laying on the page. Up here is what's referred to as the light. Okay, the light on the object. The very brightest bright spot that you might see, perhaps right about here, would be the highlight. Nothing else is going to be lighter than that. And this would be maybe the next step down. Then what you have on the back half of the sphere is the shadow. This is called the shadow on the object. And the deepest part of the shadow right here is the core of the shadow. But you notice as you go down further, all of a sudden you have these sort of glowing areas here and another one here. And what is that? That's basically light just bouncing all over the place. Light comes down, hits the tabletop, and bounces and reflects back up. So this is referred to as the reflected light. And you'll see that a lot. You know, when you set up your still lifes or however you have objects laying around, a lot of times when things are close together, light will hit a certain object and bounce off and illuminate another object from a different direction. Okay, we also have the cast shadow, which is being cast by the object. In that shadow, notice it's really dark right here at the base, but gets much lighter as it goes out here. And that's something that you really need to pay attention to. Try to match the tone of your shadow to some other tone you see in your object when you're drawing it. And you'll realize a lot of times it's a lot lighter than you believe it is. I feel like this is probably one of the biggest errors beginning students make is they tend to draw their cast shadows much too dark. In addition, they tend to draw them the wrong shape, almost as if they're being seen from above rather than from the side. And a good way to draw them correctly or get that shape to look right is if you look at your tabletop and think of it as negative space. Follow this white here. It goes to the edge of the ball, tucks under here, and then it goes this direction. If you draw that tabletop space, that little shape in here, the correct shape, it'll much more likely make your shadow the right shape. The other possibility is, or the other thing you should also be doing is sighting techniques. Compare the height of the shadow, the distance from here to here, and compare it to your object. Maybe it's only about this tall. And then you'll realize whether or not you've drawn it the right size. So how do those value scales end up affecting your finished drawing? So here's a drawing of an egg. And basically what you're trying to do is color match. So here you have the whitest white of the page. Do you find that in this drawing very much? Not so much. Maybe just in the core of this highlight, this really, really bright, shiny spot. Down here is pretty light. It's close, but it's somewhere maybe between these two. It's not quite this dark, but it's not quite that light either. And then you start having a color that's more in the mid-tone, and that's happening here in the background. It's happening here on parts of the egg, down here in the reflected light on the bottom of the egg, and some parts of the shadow. Then it gets darker. There's some darker areas here and in the background. And really not very many places where there's solid black. Maybe at the very base of the egg. It's the only place this particular artist used it. But most often, things never get quite solid black, but perhaps really at the core, at the most core of the shadows. Here's an artist's work. This is Seurat, the pointillism person, but this is actually a charcoal drawing of his. And I want you to notice something about this. So the edges of the form, once rendered in value, no longer require contours. And this isn't a great thing for your drawings. It means that they can be more realistic. Because if you think about it, nothing in life actually has a line around it. There is no contour line that goes around the edge of the table, around your body, around anything else. The way that you see the edge of the form is the difference in values. The fact that his back is slightly darker than the background. The back of his hat is darker. The edge of his hat is darker than the background. The silhouetted part of his face is darker than the background here. The front of his leg is lighter than the background. But none of these things actually have a technical line around them. All these edges are just being created by the shadows. And in fact, if you notice down here, the edge of his pants kind of gets lost. But it doesn't really matter because you, as being an intelligent human being, actually realizes that the shape of the body goes down here and then it starts picking up again around here. So it's not like it really robs you of anything in the image. In fact, a line there would just be superfluous. It would be extra, it would be unnecessary, and it would almost be like you're insulting the viewer by over illustrating. So for these drawings, we're really going to avoid using any contours at all. Here's one in graphite. It's a takeout box. And if you wanted to look at it as in terms of the value scale, here we have the darkest value in the core of the box. The next darkest area would maybe be as you're coming out. Then there's some lighter values and lighter values, and they just keep continually getting lighter until you have this flap of the box here that seems to be the brightest. One thing to note about graphite, though, is it doesn't ever get necessarily as dark as charcoal. You can't push your value range quite as far. It usually stays more in this range because graphite, when applied really, really liberally, no matter what, will never be as dark as charcoal does. And so charcoal usually tends to be a better drawing medium for a value drawing. Another example of an egg. Sorry, this photo doesn't look as good as I thought. But you can see the reflected light. You can see this little tiny edge of light along here, this core of shadow, the light on the egg itself, the shape of the cast shadow, and the length and the value. And notice too how this part of the egg seems brighter simply because of what's referred to as relative value, the darkness, the way that the artist had slightly darkened the background here, which make this then in turn appear brighter. Cool. So these are some student examples from the class. These were bottles that I'd brought in, and actually I spray painted with sort of a satin or matte white spray paint, which tends to work really good for this project. It's better to have objects that are very solid white because then they really show how the shadows fall. And what do we see here? You see the light kind of hitting along the neck and mouth of the bottle, sort of over the shoulder. Same over here. You have a shadow coming down this way. You can tell that this drawing, it looks like it was made mostly with vine charcoal, but then the artist sort of took their charcoal pencils and nibbled in these core shadows, like around the neck and here inside the mouth. Also down here, this line probably was made with a charcoal pencil, where the vine charcoal was used to sort of sculpt the lighter values. However, I also want you to notice there are no contours around any of these objects. All the edges of the form are just being made by the difference in values that the forms are. Another quite nice one. I really particularly like these cast shadows. They seem realistic. They even have a double cast shadow. You get a sense that there was two different light sources in this room. So, this part of the shadow kind of goes off this way, but over here it appears lighter. I really like it when people pay a lot of attention to the cast shadows because they tell a lot of the story of how the light is in the room. And notice how this one's kind of coming off at a different direction, and that's just because of where the placement of the light was. It hits this way on this bottle and a little bit more this way on this bottle. Here's a nice one. Again, just you can find some light that reflects back into these shadows here that are being cast. Notice all the difference of, the way the light affects the shadows that are being cast on the table. Notice how bright this bottle is over here. I wonder why that is. Reflected light. So light comes down, hits the tabletop, and it bounces back and hits the back of this bottle. So you get some reflected light here. But this one's much brighter. Why is that? Well, because it's hitting this bottle more directly and bouncing back even stronger onto this bottle on this side. Very good. And these are the projects that we're going to be working on soon. Our next one, we're going to be using what's called a subtractive value addition. So you'll be coloring your paper in completely with black charcoal and then using your eraser to paint in the light. But again, these are good examples to look at even before this assignment because, again, there are no contours around anything. The compositions of these are very strong. They're filling the entire page. The brightness of the pedestal that they're sitting on is recorded. The different tones of the cast shadows are being recorded. The little sliver of light down here, that reflected light that hits the bottom of this rock, is there and just helps bring that edge out. The difference between the direct light on top of the rocks versus sort of these mild valued shadows that are coming off the edge, and then the deeper shadows down here. Great negative space use, etc. Another example of a drawing by a student for our next project, the one after this one. Again, we're going to be working on value for a while. In fact, it's such an important aspect of drawing that everyone uses a lot of practice to get better and better at it. But one of the things that I'm looking for is give yourself enough tabletop space, enough of this space here, so that you can show these cast shadows, because that to me is part of the composition. But really fill the space too with the subject matter. Make the objects large. The larger you make them, the more room you have to work. And the more room you have to work, the easier it is for you to sculpt those values and make them more realistic. But let's look at these again. You know, you have direct light on the tops of these rocks, sort of middle tones or lighter I'm sorry, slightly darker tones on the sides. And then of course the shadows of the rocks, which then have various tones as well. You know, this one's gray and then it gets darker and then some areas really black. This core of shadow, overlapping cast shadows. I don't know if you guys can hear my kitty in the background. It's meowing away. And then one final one. This one I like because they've kind of left a lot of their mark making in, and you can see where they've raced back in with their eraser to make a lot of these choppy marks. And I like them because they're sort of expressive and they help kind of describe, one, the way that light sort of just bounces all over and across the surface of the objects, but also the texture of the rocks themselves and how they have kind of a crunchy surface. So again, we're going to be working on value for a while. Really take your time on these and do your best to modulate them and make them as realistic and the best that you can. A couple tips that I have for you is, you know, squint your eyes often. I know this sounds weird, but there's something about squinting your eyes that forces you to look more at the light and dark of things than at the object itself. Again, you're just sort of tricking yourself into seeing. Like, try it here, maybe squint your eyes at this, and it helps you sort of notice what is the brightest thing that you see in the picture and what is the darkest. And once you see that, it's almost as if you can put those two things down right off the bat. You put this dark area in and you put this light area in. And what that gives you is almost like it gives you a sense of the scope of your value range. You know what your darkest dark is. You know what your lightest light is. And then everything else is going to be sort of finding these steps in between those two. It's something I've found that makes it easier to get these to work well. Okay,